like nobody's really themselves.
When you're a teenager, if people don't like you, then you're pretty much a nobody.
I feel like on social media, everybody's judging you.
People expect you to be perfect, and when you're not, they're going to point it out. So I'd be holding my phone this way, and usually I would take my picture like over here, this angle, and then usually I would just snap it. I usually snap like 20 selfies before I find the right one.
Sometimes I text my friends and tell them to pick which one they like the best.
I think guys tend to do more the mirror selfie type thing.
I'll probably go for the mirror. The mirror is probably one of the first things I go for.
Twitter is always, what's the newest tweet? What's going on in somebody's life? Who's beefing?
But I have to get ready for the selfie. You just can't take a selfie. You have to be prepared to take a selfie.
I get really nervous around people because I care what people think about me a lot.
If I don't get like a certain amount of likes in a certain amount of time, I wonder if I should delete it or something like that.
Why isn't anybody liking us?
And I'm not gonna lie, usually when I see the likes, I get pretty happy, so. Kind of brings up my self-esteem.
Everybody has their own little group, and you try to figure out where you fit in, and you're trying to fit in and get almost all the groups to like you.
I'm a singer, so I fit in with mostly like the chorus kids, the quiet people.
I guess it makes me feel good about myself. Like, I'm pretty, I guess. Social media plays a big part in everything, really.
If you have that many followers, then you're, well, not popular, but you're accepted and everybody likes you.
Whenever I smile, one of my eyebrows raises, and it really bothers me.
Most people that people like are really outgoing, so I don't really like people to know that I'm shy. I just start to point out the things that I don't like about myself. I begin picking all the flaws that I see. My nose, it's like a little pointy, you see?
I'm always thinking about the way I look. I have pretty squinty eyes, so.
I really wish I was a little bit more muscular. Maybe I have a girlfriend or something, but I don't, so.
Well, good morning, Pathways. Thank you. Good morning. And thank you. And good morning to those of you that are joining us online. We're glad that you're listening as well. And happy Labor Day weekend. It's nice to have an extra day off, right? And a great start to college football kickoff this weekend, right? The Badgers had a great showing. That was a pretty phenomenal game. That was awesome. Actually, my team is the Texas Longhorns, so they play tonight. So you can be praying that we beat Notre Dame, because last year I had to turn it off after the first quarter. That was pretty rough. But I'm glad, I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to share with you this morning and to speak on the next generation and why we reach the next generation. And before we jump into what we're going to be talking about, I want to introduce my wife. Many of you get to see me on the weekends. Every now and then I'll host, but not all of you get to see my wife. And they're going to put a picture up there so you can see her. She's on the front row. This is my wife, Allie. It's coming. There she is. That's us on our wedding day 3.5 years ago. And we look young and fresh, and I think we still look pretty young and pretty fresh. I said on my first Sunday here, I said, you know, you probably think that Pastor Adam hired a high school student to lead the student ministry. And if it never works out being a youth pastor, I always say I could be one of those undercover like FBI agents in high schools, right? So there's always something to fall back on. But my wife is just an incredible, perfect example of what it means to be a godly wife and helpmate. And honestly, I could not do what I do on a weekly basis without her. She has as big of a heart for our students as I do, and just is involved in so many different ways of making things happen on a weekly basis. So many things that people never see. And so I'm grateful to have her as my wife, but also as a partner in ministry. And so just grateful for her. And back at the end of March, beginning of April, she wakes me up one morning really early and is in like a panic attack mode, right? And she can't breathe and she's trying to tell me something. I'm like, what in the world's going on? Like, what happened? And finally she holds up a pregnancy test And she's like crying, and I'm like, oh my word. And so we found out that our family is growing by one. And 2 weeks ago, yeah, we're excited. Thank you. 2 weeks ago, we found out that it was going to be a baby boy, so I'm super pumped. I'm really excited about that. And we're already one of those crazy parents taking lots of pictures. I saw all your school pictures. We have our own first pictures, and I think he's already more handsome than all of your kids. I'm sorry. I know I'm kind of biased, but I am one of those crazy parents already, and I'm just looking forward to it. And for those of you that have kids, you kind of know, like, that first moment when you find out you're going to have a kid, like, life changes forever. Even though he hasn't come yet, our lives have already begun to change, and we're beginning to think and process, like, oh my word, we're having a kid. Like, I don't feel old enough to have a kid, right? Like, it's crazy. Like, you never feel like you're going to be ready, and there's moments where you just feel like completely overwhelmed. In fact, last weekend we were in Milwaukee, and we're like, let's just go into this baby store, and we'll just browse, and we'll just see what's out there, what we need to buy, and worst decision ever. I don't think I've ever felt more overwhelmed in my entire life. Like, I would rather take ACTs all day long than go into another baby store. And what we found was there are like 1,000 different types of bottles, blankets, cribs, you name it. In fact, I took a picture of the stroller section, and there was 3 levels of sections of just strollers. All different shapes and sizes and colors and prices. There was one that had headlights and had a digital monitor on it that told you how fast you were going and what the weather was going to be. I'm like, whoa. I just stepped into a whole world. Like, I had no idea. And we left that store being like, I don't even know where to start. Like, where do you start with this? Like, it's crazy. Like, can't they just make one thing for everybody, and everybody just has to use that one, that one thing? If only, right? And it can be overwhelming thinking about all the decisions and the choices you're going to have to make throughout this child's life. And even more than that, though, there's been moments in the last few months where I really begin to think about the more serious things, like how I'm going to lead my son in following Jesus and passing on faith to him and to my next generation. And that responsibility and that weight is overwhelming. That I'm going to have to model what it looks like to follow Jesus, to love Jesus, to serve Jesus, to be a man of God, a man of integrity and character, what it means to love my wife. And that weight can be overwhelming. And that's what we're talking about this morning, is the weight and the burden of passing on faith to the next generation. And it's not just something that we talk about as parents. That's a responsibility solely for parents, but it's for us as a community of faith, as a church. You've heard the saying, it takes a village to raise a child, right? It takes a church to raise a disciple. And my fear is that there are some of us this morning, and when the first time you heard that we're going to be talking about the next generation, you already checked out and you're like, why did I wake up? It's Labor Day. I should have slept in. This doesn't apply to me. This is for those people that serve in Pathways Kids or Pathways students. This is for people with teenagers or kids. And to be quite frank with you, that couldn't be further from the truth of what the Bible teaches. Every single one of you have a role, have a part to play in imparting faith to the next generation, in reaching them and investing them. And we're going to break that down this morning and what that looks like for every single one of us. But every one of us has a role and a part to play. And when one of us doesn't do our part, when one of us doesn't do our job, we run the risk of dropping the baton of passing the faith to the next generation. And this morning, really the whole talk is driven by 2 key questions. And the first is, what is our legacy? What is our legacy as Pathways Church, as a community of faith? What is our legacy? We could spend a long time talking about that, and I'm sure in a room this size, there's a lot of different opinions about what our legacy is. But the second question is this: how do we build a legacy that lasts? How do we build a legacy that lasts? And to answer the first question, I'm just going to tell you, our legacy is our next generation. It's our infants, it's our toddlers, it's our middle school, high school, and college students. It's the gift of precious life that God has given our community of faith to steward right now at this specific time and place in their life. And how do we build a legacy that lasts? Well, that's what we're going to be talking through. That's what we're going to be unfolding this morning. Because we want to build a legacy that lasts. We want to build a legacy that is blessed. We want to see a next generation rise up and own their faith and lead the church to places that we could never lead it, the places that we've only dreamed about. And that's what we're talking about this morning. So who is this generation? I think it's important for you to understand, so I'm glad you asked. A lot of times when I hear adults or older people talk about the next generation, it's often in a negative context. Like, oh, they're always on their phone. They don't know how to talk. They won't talk on the phone, right? There's a lot of negative commentary on the next generation. And as we begin to talk through who they are, I just want to encourage you, choose to believe the positive and to believe life over this generation. Yes, they're completely different from you. They communicate completely different from you. But you know what the honest truth is? You communicated completely different from your parents and your grandparents. And when it comes to the next generation, there's enough negativity going up against them. As a church, as a community of faith, we need to believe in them. And we need to be on their side even when we don't understand. And so who is this generation? Well, society would call this generation Generation Z. Now, every generation has a name. I don't necessarily know how they come about, but this generation is Generation Z. So you need to think students that were born from 1996 to 2014. 1996 to 2014. So think elementary, middle school, high school, and early college. Those are the years that we're talking about here. That's the generation who we're talking about. And they are the most wired, connected generation in the history of mankind, right? They grew up with iPads and iPhones and tablets and smart everything. And they know how to use it. They know how to leverage it, right, in ways that we never could. Even my generation, just 10 years beyond them, we didn't grow up with that type of technology. And they're wired and they're connected. Their whole worlds are almost completely online. That's how they connect, right? It was fascinating. I was reading an article a couple weeks ago about how my generation, who kind of had technology growing up, we would post things like on Facebook or Twitter where lots and lots of people could see and interact with us, whereas this generation, they want personal connection through technology. So they use apps like Snapchat where they can communicate via picture individually with another person. It's really fascinating. But this whole online world impacts who they are and how they see themselves. In fact, 42% of teenagers would say that social media has a direct impact on how they see themselves, how they view themselves. Wow. That tells us that their identity, their self-esteem, their value, their self-worth is wrapped up in social media and online and how many likes they get on a picture and how many followers they have and the things that people direct message them and say to them or things that people post on their posts or their pictures. This should concern us because their identity is not rooted in Christ by and large, but on things that are happening online. One of the things, though, I do believe, though, is because they're so wired and they're so connected, is that this is a generation that really can usher in the presence of God, that can take the gospel to every tribe and every tongue and every nation. A New York Times reporter said, the world is smaller than it's ever been. He said a 13-year-old in Indiana can connect with a 13-year-old in Nairobi, Kenya, via technology. They can connect with people that we could never connect with before. But how does this impact their spiritual life? How is this generation growing up? I think this is really fascinating that 75% of American teenagers would claim to be Christian, yet only half consider it important, and fewer than half actually practice their faith as a regular part of their life. Think about that. A majority of American teenagers would claim to be Christ followers, yet only half of them actually consider their faith to be important, and fewer than that half would actually practice their faith on a regular basis. I think there's a lot of reasons why that is, but a lot of research has been done on this generation and how they're processing their Christian faith. And what it's found is that many Christian teenagers have no faith vocabulary. They demonstrate very few faith practices and have little ability to reflect on their lives from a faith perspective. I'll take a moment to take that in. Many Christian teenagers today have no faith vocabulary. They demonstrate few faith practices and have little ability to reflect on their lives from a faith perspective. Why do you think that is? Well, research would tell us that by and large, generations mirror and reflect the faith of their parents. This generation has grown up in an American church that by and large is nominal, it's apathetic, and is not modeling an authentic faith in Jesus Christ. So maybe they have no faith vocabulary because they haven't seen a faith vocabulary modeled. Maybe they have few faith practices because they haven't seen faith practices modeled. Wow. It makes us begin to look in the mirror. Ultimately, they've bought into this quasi-fake ideal of what Christianity is. It's a fake gospel. And I think it's something that they created and they developed as a generation, something that they've bought into and something they believe. Because you see, there's this huge gap that they've grown up with. There's this gap between what the Bible teaches to be truth and how the people they know and love and trust, the church, actually live. And there's this gap, and they're trying to reconcile that gap. And what's happened is they've bought into this philosophy, this idea of a gospel that's really no gospel at all, and it asserts three things. The first is that Christianity helps people be nice, it makes us feel good, and it keeps God at a distance. So essentially, Christianity, we come to church on a weekend, it helps me. I hear something, it helps me be nice to people. I leave feeling good inside about myself and who I am. But ultimately, when I walk out the doors of a church, I'm still in control, and I will decide what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. It keeps God at a distance. These things should break our heart. These things should create some urgency within us. That the time to reach the next generation, that the time to invest in them has come and gone. We're playing catch up now. We're trying to make up ground. And so how do we do this? We're going to look at the scriptures this morning, and we're going to follow a story that talks about the how and the why it's important to invest in the next generation. And it picks up in Exodus chapter 17. If you want to turn there, you can. And this narrative, this story goes through several books throughout the Old Testament. And take a deep breath. We're not going to read every chapter and verse in the Old Testament. We would if we could, but we don't have time for that this morning. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow key moments in the relationship between one of the greatest leaders in Israelite history and a young man in the next generation who he calls out and chooses to impart faith and life to. And so in Exodus chapter 17, it's the story of Moses and Joshua. Two of my favorite characters, just both really fascinating people, and we could spend years just digging into who they were and how God worked in their lives. But in Exodus chapter 17, this is the first time that we encounter their relationship. Now, we don't know at what point, but at some point, Moses calls Joshua to be his personal aide. He selects him, he chooses him. We don't have that in the scriptures, but at some point, we know that Moses selects him. He calls him to be his personal aide, to follow him, to learn from him, and to grow from him. And in Exodus chapter 17, what's happening is Moses has led the people of Israel out of slavery, out of Egypt, and they're heading towards the promised land, and they're about to go into war, into battle with a group of people called the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites weren't just any group of people. These were distant cousins to the Israelites. So this is messy, right? This isn't just war. This is like family, okay? And this is the first time Moses delegates authority to Joshua. And he says, I want you to choose some people, and you're going to go into battle. I'm going to go up on a hill. It's just kind of funny because if I was Joshua, I was thinking, okay, I'm going into battle, and you're going up on the hill. Something's wrong here. But he says, choose some men. You're going to go into battle. I'm going to go up on the hill. And in Exodus 17, 9 through 10, it says, Moses says to Joshua, choose some of the men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. What's really fascinating is Joshua is obedient. He trusts Moses. He follows him. He chooses the men, and they go into battle. And Moses is standing up on top of this hill watching the battle unfold, and he has his hands up in the air in an act of surrender to God, saying, God, we need your help. We need your strength. We need your power. We can't do this without you. It was a moment of surrender. And as long as Moses' hands were in the air, the people of Israel, Joshua was winning the battle. But at any time Moses' hands would begin to get weary and weak and they would begin to fall down, Joshua and the men of Israel would begin to lose the battle. And so some men come alongside Moses and they help hold his hands up, and eventually Joshua is victorious. And I could just see the scene. The Israelites win, and Joshua's coming back over to Moses, and God speaks to Moses to tell Joshua something very important. Because God ordained this relationship, this mentoring, coaching, investing relationship. This was a key learning moment in the life of Joshua. And it says in Exodus 17:14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. God says to Moses, you need to write this down and you need to tell Joshua and you need to tell him to remember this, that I will blot out these people. I think essentially what he's saying is this is a teaching moment for Joshua. He needs to know now that it wasn't his strength, it wasn't his power that won this war. It was my strength and it was my power and my favor. God was going to use Joshua to do some incredible things later on down in his life, but he knew that that might never be possible if Joshua didn't understand that it was only in God's strength and in his power that he would be able to do great things. The second key moment that we see between Joshua and Moses is around the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 24. And Moses is getting ready to go up to the mountain of God and receive the 10 Commandments, what we know as the 10 Commandments from God. And what's really interesting about this verse in 24:13 is that Moses doesn't take the key leaders of the people of Israel with him up on the mountain, but he does take one significant person. And as you look at this verse, it might seem really insignificant, but it's actually very critical and very important for us as we learn how to invest and reach in the next generation. It says in Exodus 20:14 that Moses set out with Joshua, his aide. And Moses went up on the mountain of God, and he goes up there to receive the 10 Commandments. What I think is so interesting and important for us today is that Moses takes Joshua along. Wherever he goes, whatever he's doing, he takes Joshua along with him because he realizes that he's never going to make a significant impact in Joshua's life if there's not a relationship. And maybe it was climbing that mountain together that they were able to have significant conversations. And Joshua is able to process things with Moses and ask him, what about this, Moses? How do I do this? Tell me about this. How do I grow deeper in my relationship with God? Who is God? And Moses takes him along. Moses realized that Joshua needed to be there with him. Joshua needed to experience things. Church, we will never reach this generation if we don't call them out and take them with us. We can't just expect them to take hold of the faith if we're not going to walk with them and show them how it's done. We have to model it for them. We have to take them with us. I think a lot of times we want to not do that, right? Because it's extra work. It takes more of us to take them with us. We have to go out of our way, right? But it's in those key moments. It's in those moments when you're in the car and you're going places that you can have some life-altering, game-changing conversations with the next generation. And they can begin to ask you, Dad, Mom, how do you do this? How do we respond in this situation and circumstance? I think the third key instance we see in their relationship is around the tent of meeting, and that's Exodus chapter 33. Exodus 33:11, we're going to read that verse in just a moment. But the tent of meeting was essentially the tabernacle or the place where God's presence would temporarily dwell. And it was the practice of Moses. He would set up this tent of meeting, this place where God's presence would dwell outside of the Israelite camp. And he would go there, and the Bible tells us that Moses would go into this tent, and the presence of God would come down like a cloud until he essentially disappeared. And God would speak to Moses face to face as if he was talking to a friend. This is the place where Moses built relationship with God, where he communed with God. And what's so cool is that the people of Israel, they would leave their camp and go out to this tent, and they would lay their requests before the Lord. You know who else was also at the tent of meeting was Joshua. Every time Moses was there, Joshua was there in this place where the tangible presence of God was dwelling. It says in Exodus 33:11, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Aren't you grateful that we have that ability today? That we can talk to God like he's our friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. Joshua is getting a glimpse, he's getting a taste of the presence of God, and he doesn't want to leave. God is beginning to capture his heart, and Moses is just modeling him. He's showing how to talk to God, how to have a relationship with God, how to draw close to the heart of God. And I am only guessing that the presence of God was so strong in that place that Joshua just did not want to leave. The presence of God was so sweet, so amazing, and maybe he was beginning to hunger and thirst for a relationship with God like Moses had, to be able to go into the presence of God and experience an intimate, deep, personal connection with his Creator. Just a key moment in his development and his spiritual growth. Their relationship continues to grow. Throughout the Old Testament, we see story after story about how Moses continues to pour into his life, continues to model, continues to teach, but it ultimately comes to an end in the book of Numbers. Moses is getting old. He's getting ready to die, and he's like, God, I need somebody to take my place. I need somebody that's going to come behind me and lead the people of Israel to new places, new heights, new depths. And thankfully, he had been preparing that person long before he probably even realized that it would be Joshua. You see, I don't think he knew that one day when I'm about to die, that Joshua is going to be the person that comes behind me. I don't think that was his intention in investing and reaching and developing Joshua, right? He selected him, he called him out, and he's imparting faith, he's taking him with him, but we don't have any idea that was his intention from the very beginning. He was imparting faith to him. And in Numbers 24:18, it says this, so the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly, and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority so the whole Israelite community will obey him. He is to stand before Eleazar the priest, who will obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord. At his command, he and the entire community of the Israelites will go out, and at his command they will come in. Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and had him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole assembly. And then he laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord instructed through Moses. What a powerful, sweet, beautiful moment that Moses gets to bless, lay his hands on, and send out this young man who he invested in when he was still a young leader at that very first battle, giving his very first taste of leadership and a little bit of authority, All the stories, all the times, all the conversations have led to this point where God has been using the older generation to prepare the next generation. What a sweet and powerful moment of fulfillment, of knowing that this kid is ready and God is going to use him to do greater things than I could ever do. He's actually going to take the people of God into the land that God promised for them. What a powerful moment. It makes me think about how Jesus would come to the earth many, many years later. And in a similar fashion, he would choose his disciples. He would take them along with him. He would do life with them. He had lunch and dinner and breakfast. He hung out with them. He spent time at their house. They hung out together. They had relationship. He taught them what it meant to follow God, to know God, to have a relationship with God. And then ultimately, he anoints them with authority and sends them out to build the church and to take the gospel to the world. It's a godly thing to pass on faith to the next generation. It's what God's called us to do as a community of faith. So how do we do this? How do we practically do this in 2016? Well, I'm going to give you 4 ways that you can begin doing this today. 4 ways that you can begin to invest and impart life to the next generation. And before we jump into these 4 ways, I want to say one thing, and I don't have any condemnation or judgment in this, but parents, we cannot partner with you as a church and as a community of faith if your teenagers, if your kids are absent. There's just no possible way. We're not omnipresent. We can't be everywhere at every time. But we have designed creative moments and experiences for your teenagers, for your middle school, your high school, your kids and Pathways kids on Sunday mornings, students on Wednesday nights, for your teenagers, where they can connect in community with other teenagers, where they can build relationships with leaders. They can hear biblical teaching and they can worship God. These are key moments, game changers in the life of your kid. Take advantage of them. Let's make this a priority as a church. Let's raise this value, because I can promise you that this isn't a holding tank for teenagers for the next 4 years, 6 years of their life where we're just playing games and stuffing their mouths with marshmallows, right? Sometimes that's what we think. But we are intentional and we're strategic about how we can pass on faith, how we can partner with you as parents. And for us as a community of faith, I think there's 4 things that we can do. And the first is this: we have to pray. We have to pray for this next generation. Say, God, I think sometimes we think that to pray for the next generation means that we have to be on our hands and knees for an hour every morning, right? No, pray on your way to work. When you're in the car and you have 10 minutes, pray for our middle school and our high school and our kids as they go to school, that God would guard their hearts, that God would guard their minds, that God would reveal himself to them in a way that they've never experienced before, that God would speak to their hearts. It's powerful because kids and teenagers, they can hear God's voice and they can respond. We are in the middle of a very spiritual battle that's waging for the war for the soul for their souls. And we as a church must engage in spiritual warfare and begin to pray for this generation, that God would capture their hearts and that God would protect them. Pray for them. I think reasons why we just don't know how. Maybe we don't know how, maybe it's not on our radar, maybe we don't think we have time for it. But we have to make this a priority. If we're going to effectively pass on faith to the next generation, we have to pray for them. And as we pray for them, I'm telling you, God will burden your heart. God will break your heart for our next generation. The second thing that we need to do is model what authentic faith looks like. We've got to model it. There's too big of a gap between what we say we believe and what we actually do. And it's time for us as a church to grow up, to be adults, to be mature, and to lead the next generation in what it really means to model authentic faith in the good times and in the really hard times. We have to show them that we follow Jesus no matter what. What does it look like to have godly, healthy relationships? What does a godly marriage look like? What does a godly work ethic look like? All of these types of things we have to share, we have to model. I think another key aspect of this is sharing your faith story. What has God done in your life? What are the miracles that God has done for you and in you and through you? How has he gone before you? How has he come behind you in your life? They need to hear your story. They need to hear who God is to you and what he's done in your life. It's so, so important. If you look throughout history, faith has always been passed down through stories of who God is and what he's done. We have to share our stories. We have to model what authentic faith looks like. Thirdly, we need to serve. Now, the goal of my message is not to try to get as many volunteers on Wednesday night as possible. But I think we as a church, we need to step up our game when it comes to serving. You see, you could be an usher or a greeter, and this topic hasn't escaped you, right? Because on Sunday morning, hundreds of kids and students will come into our building, and they're watching how you serve. So you don't have to directly serve in Pathways Kids or Pathways students to impact the next generation. But we do need men and women that will step up and say, I'll give up a Wednesday night to serve the next generation, to build relationship with a middle school boy or a middle school girl, with a high school boy with a high school girl. I'll give up my Sunday mornings once a month or twice a month to serve in Pathways Kids because the next generation matters. We have to serve. I think a lot of times what happens in the church today is, well, first I'll say this. If you're in a season where you need to sit on Sunday mornings and receive and heal, that's awesome. Stay there and be there. But don't stay there forever. At some point, you have to begin exercising your faith, and you have to find a place to serve, to plug in and get involved. I think there are too many Christians in the church today that are just putting on stretchy pants as we get bigger and bigger and bigger, sitting in our seats, not exercising our faith. And the reality is the only way we can exercise it is through serving and pouring out. God never intended for us just to be filled up and to be filled up and filled up. He wants us to pour out. And what better way than to pour out into the next generation? If we are going to be healthy as a church, if we are going to be healthy as a community, we have to exercise our faith and serve. And lastly, I think we do this by resourcing the next generation. You can resource them. Maybe you can't go, maybe you can't serve, but maybe you can resource a student. Throughout the year, we create moments and opportunities for students to grow in their relationship with God, to go to a new level, to experience new things. That would include a winter retreat where we have key moments that are designed for them to just experience the presence of God and to grow in their relationship with Him. We have 2 mission trips that we're going on this next summer, a middle school missions trip that's going to be more local and a high school missions trip that's going to be overseas. These are not vacation cruises, okay? The purpose of these trips is for students to step outside of their comfort zone and to go on mission with God, to tell people that they've never met before who Jesus is and who Jesus is to them and what He's done in their life. It's in these moments where they're stepping outside of their comfort zone and beginning to go on mission with God that they have defining moments that they will forever look back to and remember, that was a moment when my life changed forever. And my faith began to become my own and not my parents'. They cost money. Help send some kids on some mission trips. Help send some kids to winter camp. Be a part of resourcing Pathways Kids, Pathways students on a regular basis so that we really can, as a church, as a community of faith, offer our next generation the very best. Because I think they deserve our very best. And not our leftovers, not our scraps. They deserve our very, very best. What happens when you, when I, when us, as a community of faith, step out and say, we're going to do something, we're going to pray, we're going to model, we're going to serve, we're going to resource, life change happens, and the next generation begins to take and own their faith in Jesus Christ. Check out Amy's story.
My name is Amy, and I am an 8th grade small group leader for the girls at Pathway Students.
Yeah, I'm Aubrey, and I'm a Pathway student, and I've been in Amy's group.
Last fall, Chase was speaking on leadership and had asked anyone in the congregation if anyone was interested in becoming a leader at Pathway Students. I felt this nudging from God, and I thought, nope, this is way out of my comfort zone. And I thought, okay, God, I did what you wanted. Talk to Chase, talk to Allie. That's all I'm gonna do. I'm not gonna hear anything more from them. This is it. I'm gonna go home. I'm good. I'm gonna remain in my comfort zone. About 2 days later, I got an email from Chase basically saying, welcome aboard. Here's the background application. I'm happy to have you become a youth leader. For a moment, I had just a minute of panic thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do? I was very scared, but yet very excited. One of my biggest fears was how was I going to relate with these kids? Some of the other leaders were young, hip, that some of these 8th grade girls were gonna relate more to the younger leaders. But my first impression of Aubrey was just a very sweet, down-to-earth girl. She volunteered to pray the first night that I was there, and I was so impressed with that.
I remember one night going to Pathways, and I was really down because I felt like I was in the middle of my parents' divorce, and I didn't really know how to deal with it. And I came to Pathways, and I was like, oh, here's like my second family, and I can like let it all out, and they'll like be there to care for me. And I remember going into Pathways, and I just started bawling, and I didn't know how to handle it. And all through the service, I was crying, and the songs, I was crying. But afterward, we were all in small group, and Amy and Allie knew I was going through the rough time, and afterward they sat down and prayed with me and helped guide me to do what God wanted me to do through the divorce.
I don't think they want us to fix it. They don't want us to make the problem go away. They just want to know that we care and that we're there for them. And we genuinely care. We care about who they are as a person and what's going on in their lives, whether it be just a text that we send them to be like, hey, have a great week. Hey, good luck on your test today. How are you doing? Anything I can pray for you for this week. And when they can see that you are just like them, you were in the place that they're in, you've gone through some of the same things that they've gone through, I think it really helps you to connect on a level that you may not have been on before.
She can turn a sad day and make it happy, if I ever just there to be a little bit of encouragement if they don't have that at home, or even if they do, just to have someone always there for you.
I can be at church, and I can just kind of sometimes get so caught up in the busyness of being a mom and realizing, okay, I need to go here, go there, and I can be walking through church, and all of a sudden behind me is these arms and hey, and it's Aubrey, and just to be like, you know what, I am making a difference, and it's just really cool. It's cool.
That's what happens when we step out of our comfort zone and we pursue after this next generation. But what happens when we, as a community of faith, as Pathways Church, drop the baton, it's not on our radar, and we're not investing and we're not reaching the next generation? The Bible gives us a very clear picture in the book of Judges. See, by this time, Joshua had taken leadership over the people of Israel, and he's led them into a new place. And now he's old, and he's come to the end of his time, and he's passed away. But something happened in that process. The baton was dropped. And it says in Judges chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, that a whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. They didn't know God, and they didn't know what he had done. And then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. This is what the Bible calls a lost generation. A whole generation was lost. A generation grew up that didn't know God, that didn't know who he was and what he had done. So why should they serve him? Why should they follow this God that their parents didn't talk about, that their parents didn't model a relationship with, that their parents didn't honor him? At some point, they dropped the baton. And we think, as a church, as a community of faith, that could never happen. I hate to tell you, but the American church as a whole is losing hundreds of thousands of graduating seniors every single year that are leaving the doors of the church never to return again, because there's this huge gap between what we say we believe and how we actually live. It's time for us as a church to model. It's time for us to serve. It's time for us to resource. And it's time for us to pray for this generation like there's no tomorrow. Because they deserve it. Because they're the precious gift of life that God has given us, their church. And I'm not just saying that because I'm the youth pastor. I'm saying it because this is what the Bible teaches us. Church, we cannot allow a lost generation on our watch. It's not just for youth leaders. It's not just for Pathways kids, volunteers. This is for all of us as a body of Christ at Pathways Church. We're raising the value. We're raising the awareness. It has to be on your radar now. It's time for us to grow up, and it's time for us to reach this generation. They are different from you. They communicate different from you. Learn from them. Reach out to them because they are waiting. They are desperate. They are hungry to know you and to hear your story and how God intervened in your life and how God came through and provided in miraculous ways for your family. And in doing so, in that relationship, and you're calling them out and taking them with you and showing them how to serve God, you are going to pass on faith to the next generation. We're going to reach them. They're an incredible, phenomenal generation of students and kids. And they deserve our very best. They deserve our all. Would you stand with me this morning? God, we just come and we humble ourselves before you, and we ask that as a body of Christ, as a community of faith, God, that you would help us not to overlook this generation, not to get distracted by what's on our left or what's on our right, to not get distracted by things that are good but not best, to get distracted by things that are important but not ultimate. God, help us as a church to go after this generation, to realize that we all have a part to play, to love them like you loved us, to pursue them like you pursued us, Lord, and to speak into their life, to build relationship with them, and to help pass on faith to them. God, I thank you for this church. I thank you, God, for what we're going to do, and I ask that you would help us. Give us the grace, give us the strength to learn and love this generation like you've called us to. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.